My family, shortbread was always associated with Christmas, and my mother would always make a pan of shortbread during the holidays. She always burnt the edges, which became my favorite part, and then she would cut the interior pieces into small squares, which were always delicious. The origin of shortbread goes back to Scotland, and the earliest recipes showed up in a cookbook in 1736. Originally, it was 1, 2, 3, 1 part sugar, 2 parts butter, 3 parts wheat flour. It's named shortbread because of its crumbly texture. The cause of the texture is the high fat content. To make these shortbread cookies, you need very few ingredients. You need 3/4 of a pound of room temperature butter, 1 cup of sugar, 3½ cups of flour, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt. You'll also need some sugar for the top, and if you're going to dip them in chocolate, some chocolate that will be melted later. You start with your 3/4 of a pound of butter at room temperature. You'll know it's at room temperature when it will hold a fingerprint, which this does, but you can't stick your finger through the butter. It still has some firmness to it. With your butter transferred into a mixing bowl, this is a huge amount of butter, but that's why shortbread is so delicious. Kind of chop it up a little bit, and then we're going to cream the butter and sugar together. The creaming together at this point makes your cookies lighter. Traditional shortbread would be much denser if the butter and sugar are not creamed together with the vanilla. Once you have your butter nicely creamed, add your 1/4 of a teaspoon of salt. I always use unsalted butter. That's one of the reasons I'm adding the salt. A teaspoon of vanilla. That's just for a little flavor. That's not necessarily a traditional ingredient. And now I'm going to add the entire cup of sugar and continue beating until it's nice and fluffy. As you're incorporating your 3½ cups of flour into your butter and sugar mixture, it's a lot of flour to add, and I'm finding that using my wonderful pastry cutter is a wonderful tool to start incorporating the flour and butter together without overworking the dough. Once you've done as much as you feel you can do with your pastry cutter and spatula, it's time to just plunge your hands in and start grabbing hunks and squeezing with your hands. We're looking to form it into a ball. This recipe makes a lot of dough and could easily be cut in half, but I'm making the full recipe because I'm going to freeze half of it for future use. But meanwhile, as I'm bringing it all together with my hands, I did separate my first balls out as I bring this last batch together. Much easier to work in smaller batches. So this dough is very thick. You want it that way. I'm using my pastry scraper to square off the edges. This should make about 10 cookies. Using a cookie cutter or a knife, or in my case, I'm going to actually be using a ravioli cutter. I'm just going to come in here and press down, release. I'm going to be cutting these squares in half. So there's 3 squares, which I'll be cutting. And now for our round one. It looks like I'll have 3 rounds as well. So because I'm going to cut these into triangles, I'm actually going to end up with 12 beautiful shortbreads. I'm not going to cut the rounds. And just sprinkle a light coating of sugar on the top of each of them. This is just regular granulated sugar, not the coarse sugar. Coarse sugar didn't want to stick, so I'm just using the granulated sugar on these. Into a 350-degree preheated oven for 20 to 25 minutes. I've melted my chocolate gently, and now with a knife, I'm just spreading the chocolate onto a corner of each of these pieces of shortbread. These cookies lend themselves well to witchcraft if you want to experiment with different flavors such as orange or lemon or even almond. But I prefer just the plain version, just drizzled with this nice chocolate. To me, it makes a perfect cookie. My husband has fond memories of a family friend named Nan McKenzie, who owned a small restaurant on Wall Street in New York City. And each Christmas, she would send a tin of her famous Scottish shortbread to his family. Scottish shortbread or shortbread cookies have always been one of his family favorites.